So in this lecture, we will be discussing the connection between fiscal deficit, national debt, and trade. Now, you might be hearing a lot about the rising national debt, which is now more than $20 trillion. In addition, also we are talking about rising trade deficit. And what I'm going to show you, there's an interconnectedness between fiscal deficit, national debt, and trade deficit. To understand the connections, first let's talk about what are the impact of government borrowing or budget deficit on domestic savings, investment, and trade balances. So, government borrowing, we know, does affect domestic savings. If government borrowing is increasing, which means that government is taking away money, so people like you and me will be putting less money in the banks. As a result, rising government deficit or budget deficit leads to decreased domestic savings. If there's a decrease in domestic savings, it also means that there's a decrease in domestic investment. Finally, I'll show you is this government borrowing also affect trade balance. And by trade balance, remember, it typically, if higher the government borrowing, so increased government borrowing can lead to increased trade deficit. Now the question is how all these things are connected. To answer this question, we'll go back to our national saving and investment identity. Remember, we did that in earlier chapters where we talked about how quantity supplied of financial capital equal to quantity demanded of financial capital. Now, who supplies financial capital? It's supplied by people like you and me through domestic private savings, and also it's from the trade deficit. So import minus, so M stands for import, X stands for exports. So this is X stands for exports, and the difference between imports and exports gives us a trade deficit. So if you are running a trade deficit, then that means some money from somewhere is coming to fill up that deficit. On the other hand, who is demanding financial capital? First, obviously, private investors like factories in the United States. And suppose you want to start a company, whatever. So that's investment. And also from the government sector. If government expenditure is more than taxes they're collecting, that also a source of demand for investments or financial capital. Now, in an ideal world, the quantity supplied of financial capital should be equal to quantity demanded of financial capital. Now, if any one of them are out of sync, that means something needs to adjust. For example, if budget deficit increases, suppose this increases. Having said that, if savings and investment remain same, that means we need to run a higher trade deficit, because until we run a higher trade deficit, we cannot have a capital account surplus through which all the money comes into this country, the foreign money especially. To motivate all these things, let me show you an article that came up in NPR. So this is an article that came up published in NPR. It's about America has a large trade deficit, but economists aren't too concerned about it. So this goes completely counter to the current policy that's in place where we are trying to reduce our trade deficit. Then how come economists are not worried? So let's try to understand the connections. Like a lot of Americans, President Trump sees the US trade deficit as an urgent problem, a symbol of US economic decline. Any way you look at it, it is the largest deficit of any country in the history of our world. It's out of control. Trump said earlier this month when he announced proposed tariffs on Chinese imports. Most economists of various political leanings are a lot less worried about the trade gap, which totaled $568 billion last year. I don't think it's a problem for the US to have a large trade deficit, says Veronique de Rugy, senior research fellow at the Markets Center at George Mason University. The United States buys a lot of products from other countries, everything from oil and chemicals to shoes and automobiles, and when it does, it pays for them in dollars, she notes. As a result, countries such as China and Japan accumulate vast piles of US currency. Those countries have to exchange those dollars for something, and for a long time they have been used them to buy US assets such as stock, real estate, and treasury bills. Every dollar that we send in exchange for goods will come back to US from foreigners in the form of investment. In a sense, if you think about it, it's a win-win for the US, Derugi says. Bilateral trade deficits such as last year 375 billion US goods gap with China are even less important, says Alan Blinder, a former Federal Reserve governor and the professor of economics. They are absolutely normal components of trade. I now have a very large bilateral trade surplus with my employer, Princeton University, which gives me a paycheck and I buy almost nothing from the university, Blinder says. I have a bilateral deficit with the grocery store where I buy lots of food and they buy nothing from me. That's the way trade goes, he says. Blinder says trade deficits can become a problem if foreigners suddenly stop wanting to invest in a country. That's what happened to Greece, he notes. So what you are seeing what you learn about the last article is this: the foreign money actually coming to the United States simply because we are running a big trade deficit. So if we run a trade deficit, that means somebody is running a trade surplus. So let's take the case of China. Huge trade deficit with China. So China is sitting with a lot of US dollar. And what they're doing with those US dollar? Actually, they're bringing those US dollar to US to lend to us. And that's why China is the biggest holder of US Treasury bills with more than $1.1 trillion at this point of time. Why China is the biggest lender to us? Because they are running a huge trade deficit and they have to invest their dollars somewhere. So this whole question of trade deficit, fiscal deficit, national debt are all interconnected. So if we run a huge fiscal deficit, only way it can be fulfilled either by decreased investment, increased saving, or by borrowing from abroad, which is equivalent to running a huge trade deficit. You can only borrow from abroad if you run a positive trade deficit in this country. The US budget deficit rises and foreign financial investment provides the source of funds for that budget deficit. So foreigners want to invest in US, especially in US treasury bills. So what they start doing, they start buying up US currencies. Now when you start buying US dollar, you increase the demand for US dollar. And we all know when demand for a good increases, its value increases. So as a result, what happens? This causes a stronger exchange rate. So which means that the value of dollar is increasing because our government is willing to borrow from abroad and they are borrowing from abroad. Now the problem is this: when the exchange rate becomes more valuable or exchange rate increases, it leads to further trade deficit. Why? When exchange rate increases, which means that imports become cheaper and exports becoming expensive, which means that for the foreigners, for them to buy American products become very expensive, but for us it's relatively cheaper to buy foreign products. So in turn, this stronger exchange rate leads to more trade deficit. So here's the connection. So increased budget deficit means increased borrowing by US government, which leads to stronger dollar. Stronger dollar means lower export, because for foreigners it's become expensive to buy American products, and import, which means that increase trade deficit. And this is the basic connection between running fiscal deficit and trade deficit. Now, one of the reasons we have huge trade deficit simply because our government is spending a lot of money. Now, is it good? Is it bad? It depends on the situation, what we are borrowing for. If we are borrowing this money to build better roads in US, better schools in US, we do invest all this money in productivity increases, that's good. If we borrow more money, which we don't use for productive purposes, then it's a loss. Always remember, as I mentioned earlier, borrowing is not a bad thing till you can invest that borrowed money. The day you borrow because to consume, that's a problem. Because of the increasing budget deficit, we have high trade deficit and it connects to our international market.